welcome to another ContinuousX podcast, where we solve for X in the SDLC equation. Today I have with me my colleague Mike Fitzurka, and our guest today is Trey Bostick, Senior Director for Tech Domain Strategies for Application Lifecycle.
Yeah, we're in face-to-face.
Yeah, I know.
I think this is our first episode.
So first of all, guys, thanks for
it's the first time I've met you.
Yeah,
Hi.
I appreciate both of you inviting me in today. I'm excited to be here. And also, as you said, super cool, right, to be back live and in person.
Absolutely.
At least, to some degree or another. So looking forward to the conversation.
Well, Trey, tell us about the recent news with TD SYNNEX Public Sector announcement and its impact and effect on the industry.
Yeah, so great question. It's super exciting news. Literally a week ago today, on October 5th, the global announcement formally into the public space around TD SYNNEX Public Sector was made. And at a high level, our tagline for that group is a powerhouse by design to accelerate public sector growth. And what does it mean for industry, right? And if you look across the three sort of versions or verticals within industry, right, which is obviously our vendors that we work with on a daily basis, the channel ecosystem that's involved with us, and then obviously end user customers as well. Very exciting news for all three of those groups. When you look at the vendors, obviously it's bringing together sort of three if you will, legs of the stool, right? As most folks are probably aware at this point, Tech Data and SYNNEX merged in September of 2021. Mm-hmm. And so here we are roughly a year and a few weeks later, and the collaborative compressing, if you will, of the three public sector organizations within those three areas, including DLT, former DLT, have now come together to form this TD SYNNEX Public Sector organization. And what it does is it obviously allows for a much larger scale.
Yeah.
When we look across that, we have roughly 400 total employees across the organization working with a specialization in the public sector space. It's a total of 75 years when you bring all the mind share and the mind knowledge of the organization together in the public sector space. Continues to be very dedicated and obviously at a very high level in engaging with industry in the space, which is very unique, as we all know, right?
Agreed, yeah.
And then even more unique is when you get into the verticals or the segments within the public sector, right? So we'll be servicing obviously the U.S. federal government. We'll be continuing to serve the U.S. SLED market, obviously state, local education institutions of higher learning.
Right.
And then I would also throw in, we're seeing a unique sort of thing happening in industry. I'd say over the last 2 to 3 years now, where you're seeing vendors and organizations out in the space look at regulated industries as well and how those might, come into underneath the umbrella, right? Mm-hmm. Which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because when we talk about regulated industries, typically who are they regulated by? The federal government, or maybe in some cases state and locals. So that's also very interesting. But what it really does is again, it gives us a broader span. It also gives broader access for our channel partners and the ecosystem there and our end user community. It has broadened out the vendor base that they have access to. Yeah. We hear government talk all the time about solution-based acquisition or the desire to streamline things and one-stop shop. I love that expression. This really looks like that. It really presents an opportunity both to the channel ecosystem, who are obviously responding into end users, and the end user community coming downhill back through the partner ecosystem and distribution to really try to consolidate the point of purchase.
It really does dovetail nicely. I've never seen like mergers and acquisition, Mike and I, and I'm sure you have experienced this in the past where, okay, you have overlap, you have redundancy. This really, in terms of portfolio, really does match like a 1 + 1 + 1 equals greater than 3.
Yeah, agreed.
So I think that's significant for our industry.
Yep. So I think, again, we're obviously as an organization super excited by the announcement last week. One of the other really interesting things that I think this brings to the table, maybe for folks that are specifically familiar and comfortable with one of the three sort of legacy groups, and I know from our side, we've had a lot of vendors, reach out to us asking us about services capabilities across the years. Yeah. That is one of the other really sort of major items that I probably would call out specifically here that's being brought to the table now. Is the ability of the SYNNEX, the former SYNNEX and former TD, lines coming together brings a really interesting service capability to the mix.
Lots more engineers to the table.
Exactly. And then of course, right, it goes without saying, from an end user perspective and for our vendors, it really broadens out the width of the partner ecosystem. Probably I would say 10x compared to what, the typical DLT, statement has been. So again, we're super excited about this organization. Obviously the launch, we've heard feedback from the streets, been very well received so far, as expected. And we're looking forward to really seeing what this thing turns into as it starts to kind of, bloom or blossom, if you will, right? The bud and the stem was announced last week. And now we're going to see how that flower, comes to fruition. I think people are super excited about it. And it has nothing really from my perspective than upside. Again, anytime you take change, right? As human beings, a lot of us are averse to change, but I think again, this is something that's going to be really beneficial, really for all three of our sort of focal groups. Again, right? Our OEM vendors, the partner ecosystem, and ultimately the end user customers. Not to mention ourselves as an organization.
Right. So, our ContinuousX podcast, our secure stateside support, well, not secure stateside support.
That too.
Well, that too, but the software framework, those all fall under the application lifecycle, and I know that's part of your very long title. How is that going to affect our focus on application lifecycle?
Yeah, so great question, Mike, and I appreciate you asking me that. Again, this is not to make it all about me, but this is sort of a really exciting opportunity for me as an individual in my career. What it's really allowing me to do is move into a role. And by title, right, it's got the word strategic or strategy in the title. And that's by design. I mean, this is really going to be an opportunity for me to look at, with my coworkers who will obviously very much continue to be involved. Yourself and Rick certainly, will be right there with me as we go down this journey. But what it's really going to allow us to do is from my perspective, take a much, I don't know that broader is how I would define it. I would probably call it a lengthening. We're going to lengthen the view or lengthen the runway.
Right.
So where, we've typically operated, and we've always had the idea, operated from some perspective around what I'd call sort of a midterm strategy from a length. But we also very much, obviously, in the day-to-day of our business, have to, pay attention to what's going on today, within the month, within the year. This new role is really going to allow us to kind of open that up and say, what are we looking at from what I classify as sort of the mid to long-term range? Like I'd say 3 years, maybe 5 maxed out, but really the 36-month kind of rolling window is what we're looking at. And what that's going to allow us to do is look at our application lifecycle vendors. And just as a quick side trip, we're also doing this across our other tech domains. So there's other folks stepping into similar roles in our other tech domains that are going to take these same kind of things on. And so we'll see this universally across those. But it's exciting because it allows us to formulate a 36-month plan, right? Instead of working in an annual planning vacuum where we're kind of like, what are we going to do for this fiscal year? Like any good corporation or large business, right? You always want to have a focus on that time frame that's important to you, right? But you also have to look at beyond, right? It's not 365 days from December 1st on our new fiscal start over. We start thinking about FY24, right? We're thinking about it now. What does that look like? And a lot of those things will come back to, vendor acquisition targets, right? When we look at application lifecycle, and Mike, you mentioned it, our secure software factory and our sort of, framework and our that's our IP. I mean, I kind of look at that and go, that's a really, cool IP that we have. And you guys have really, I give credit where credit is due. That's really y'all's baby. And you guys have done a fantastic job with that. And you mentioned CSS, right? The confirmed stateside support. I've had the good opportunity, first of all, to have many vendors who take advantage of that program. I'm a big believer and I love it. I think, it's a differentiator in the marketplace that the TD SYNNEX Public Sector organization brings to the table. And that's of interest to our vendors because it gives those vendors an edge up. It's not only a differentiator for us, but it's a differentiator for those vendors. So that's really what this new role is about, is how do we take that application lifecycle tech domain and get a more midterm, longish term view of it. And what that's going to really allow for, in my mind is, again, the continuation and sort of, I don't know what the right version number is. You guys can tell me. I don't know if we're on 3.0 of our SSF or something like that, but we're going to be able to progress that. We're obviously going to be able to progress some other things around the application lifecycle, tech domain. But what I also believe it truly does is it allows us to, support our vendors in a different fashion because we're going to be able to get a little more focused than maybe we have historically. I also would say that it will allow us to truly create a solution-based or maybe a semi-solution-based. And what I mean by that is this, and you guys have done a really good job educating me, right? When we look across the sort of the cradle to grave of the SSF program, right? We know we have end user customers and we have partners who are involved in those where they already have certain aspects of it covered. How do we help those partners potentially expand and evolve their approach to the DevSecOps, part of the world under this SSF framework? And how do they have the opportunity to pick and choose high-level quality vendors to maybe fill in the places where they have gaps? Same thing for the end user customers, right? And as we've always talked about internally, we take a very agnostic approach there, right? We never look to dictate to an end user or dictate to a partner who they plug in the framework. But what we really want to be able to do is give them the breadth of a menu or selection, drop down, if you will, to kind of plug that in where they're able to do it all with us or as much of it as they can with us. So again, super exciting opportunity. Again, for me individually, I think it's an awesome setup and scenario for the organization. And again, as we kind of dovetail it back to the launch of the TD SYNNEX Public Sector, right, the vendor breadth is wider. And one of the other things, just to kind of close this out, to kind of maybe try to sort of loop and tie it all together is, historically we haven't done a lot of hardware work.
Exactly.
Right. And while the world sort of seems to be moving more and more towards virtual machines, et cetera, I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's a room directly behind us that has a really cool rack. For the non-technical guy in the room has a really cool rack thing going on. There's still going to be a need for hardware, right? We all understand that. And so that's one of the other kind of cool things, again, is in places where historically, as an organization, we may not have been able to do that. That's broadening out. So long story short, as we kind of roll this all together, it's a great opportunity to service all of our customers or all of our partners in the ecosystem and our vendors, in my opinion, in a much higher level than we have historically. So
let me just add on to that because I love the strategic vision of this, because in our tech domain, there are lots of innovative companies that might be just fledgling right now or technologies that are fledgling. And you got to give them time to blossom and see what the industry thinks of that particular technology and what's going to be adopted. And then you also mentioned the hardware, which edge is becoming more and more important in the ecosystem. And you need software and technology in order to support a particular challenge.
Well, and I think if I could, Rick, just to comment on one thing you said there, when you talk about sort of, edge technologies or emerging technologies, right? We always talk about when you use that sort of industry term of an emerging technology, what do you really mean by that, right? Because there certainly are, established software and hardware vendors who are emerging into the space.
Yes.
And so that's always one of the ways I look at them is, are you a 20 or 30-year-old company? You've been successful commercially, but you've never really tried to foray into the public sector arena. There's that. And then there's obviously, the really true emerging tech.
Garage.
Yeah. As you've heard me say before, the young person that's in the basement at mom and dad's house, and they've come up with something really cool, and they come up for dinner and the folks are at the table and they say, I just really came up with this neat thing today downstairs, and the parents look at them and go, okay, well, now what? and they look at them with this sort of deer in the headlights look, and that's obviously how do you go to market, right?
Exactly.
They've created a really cool technology. There's something that's bleeding edge, and again, is a differentiator. We help all those vendors as well. And again, kind of to your point, breaking into this industry, right?
It's
this
difficult.
Public sector industry is difficult. There are so many compliance things and so many, quote, rules, unquote, that you have to deal with in this, business vertical that you don't deal with in the commercial spaces, right? And so, again, fledgling companies, as you said, they need support, and they need somebody to kind of hold their hand, at the initial stages while they get that, investment or buy-in from the government, right? What we want to try to do is create an environment for those organizations where they aren't blocked at trying to actually be able to grow their business, people, and get their high-tech, technology in place and being used, because they can't get there because they don't understand the acquisition, actions that are required. They don't understand what the government customer has to go through from a justification perspective. Maybe they don't understand the fact that the customer has to have budget, and that budget is literally at a line item level established early in the year. So it can take a couple of years to get yourself on the line item ledger and be ready for acquisition. So again, that's, all exciting stuff. Again, like I said, as an employee of the organization, super excited about this change. Hopefully that's coming through here. I think, I feel pretty excited as we're sitting here. So I think people hopefully are seeing that. And again, I would probably close this out by saying, anybody that's watching this, if you have any questions, never hesitate to reach out, to the three of us individually or whatever, or anybody else that here in the organization. We'd certainly love to talk to you about the changes, what it potentially means for you and your organization, et cetera. So thanks for the time, guys. I really appreciate
Trey, you almost closed this out.
You just need to throw out the tagline.
These are terrific. And again, thank you for your time, Trey.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate it. I'm really excited about the opportunity, Mike, as always. And thank you for the viewerships to listen and spend your time while we announce this new venture and exciting world where we're going to try to solve for X in the SDLC equation.